Reflection number 3, practices of describing. This topic involves, you guessed it, 2 more films, or I guess, I don't know if you'd call them films, but Margaret Mead's Bathing a Baby in Three Cultures and Ron Frick's Barakas, or Baraka. Thought I saw an S at the end of that. And the practices of describing. The practice of describing, I think, is really interesting, especially in the way that these 2 films differ and how they deal with that, which is, hold on, how these 2 films deal with the practices of describing is how the subject matter is described. It deals with the way that I interpreted was describing the subjects of a film as something to be observed compared to something to be experienced. Because Margaret Mead, the way that she describes the mothers with their children that they're washing, she's describing it. It's something to be observed. You're supposed to observe how they wash it, where they wash it, because I think it was the African mother had to be wary of alligators in the water. That's not something the American woman had to worry about. That's compared to Baraka, which is something to be experienced. There's no words, no narrator. But Baraka is an infinitely more, I would say, entertaining, but that's not the point. It's an infinitely more educational film. Because since there's no words, you don't have to be held back by comparing it to how you interpret things. Because if you saw an African tribe doing a tribal dance, you would compare it to maybe the narrator would compare it to a dance of where they're from or something. You don't have to worry about that. It's an amazing film with such incredible imagery, but there's no words. You just get to watch, and it's confusing. It can definitely be confusing, especially if you don't know where they're from or what's happening, or if there's some kind of point to any of it. But what Baraka does with practices of describing is it melds everything. It's almost like a melody, because it shows religious practices from one culture to another culture, and then it just kind of blends into a different culture. Then you're in the desert, then you're in the mountains, then you're in Indonesia, and then you're in Egypt or Jerusalem. All these different people, and you experience all of them, and it's incredibly fascinating. But the way that practices of describing tie into this is, like how I said before, something to be observed compared to something to be experienced. Baraka is a film that lets you almost experience life in other places on the planet, whereas Margaret Mead's Bathing a Baby in Three Cultures, not only does it only show you 3 cultures, but you're looking at it through a very thin lens, a very small lens. And those are differences in the practices of describing.